Okay, let's unpack this because it's a bit of a head scratcher. You've got two of the world's largest democracies, right? The United States and India,
Yeah.
both supposedly champions of freedom, self-governance, but their relationship during the Cold War, it was, well, you could generously call it bumpy.
Bumpy is putting it mildly.
Yeah.
Often downright frosty,
Oh,
actually.
exactly. So the big question we're tackling today is why? Why didn't these seemingly natural allies, see eye to eye?
That's the fascinating puzzle, isn't it? And that's what we're diving into today. We're going deep into the, well, complex and often really misunderstood history of U.S.-India relations during the Cold War. And we're drawing heavily on historian Sarah Payne's research here.
Right. And our mission really is to get a handle on those key moments of friction, understand the underlying reasons why a strong alliance just never quite clicked, despite, some similarities on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to explore how miscalculations, maybe, and just fundamentally different ways of looking at the world shaped this whole dynamic.
And what's really striking is how off the mark the initial assumptions were, right from the beginning.
How so?
Well, the U.S., in its early Cold War thinking, sort of operated under this idea that if they provided aid to both India and Pakistan,
Hedge your bets kind of thing.
exactly, that this aid would naturally pull them into the Western sphere of influence, away from the Soviets.
Right, the classic win-win idea. Give everyone some goodies, they'll all be your pals. But Sarah Payne's research shows that just totally underestimated both India and Pakistan's, well, strategic thinking.
Completely. They were perfectly happy to take support, sure, but they were very much set on doing their own thing on the world stage. Strategic autonomy was key.
So the U.S. approach missed that whole post-colonial desire for real independence.
Precisely. Both countries had just shaken off imperial rule. They were incredibly sensitive to any hint of external influence telling them what to do. So this simple idea of, aid for allegiance, it was just flawed. They played the Cold War game quite skillfully, actually.
Yeah.
Taking help from different sides, but guarding their own foreign policy fiercely.
Okay.
And then there were the U.S. efforts to mediate between India and Pakistan. Those also kind of fell flat.
You mean trying to be the peacemaker? Just
Yeah.
annoyed everyone?
That's pretty much the gist of it. The
Yeah.
core miscalculation was this belief that somehow external pressure or, even just well-meaning diplomats could solve these really deep politically charged disputes.
Okay, so a bit of a misread of the situation from the U.S. side, but it wasn't just strategic blunders, was it? You mentioned different worldviews.
Oh, absolutely. There were some fundamental differences. On the Indian side, there was this significant undercurrent of skepticism towards the U.S., and it wasn't new.
Really?
Yeah, even back during FDR's time, Mahatma Gandhi was quite critical. He pointed out the glaring hypocrisy of the U.S. pushing democracy abroad while having racial segregation at home.
Wow. Yeah, Payne mentions Gandhi and others feeling like if they'd been in the U.S. then, they'd have been forced to sit at the back of the bus. That really puts it into perspective.
It really does. And this feeling, this disillusionment, went beyond race. Nehru, and later Indira Gandhi, had very different political ideologies from the dominant American view.
How so?
They were suspicious of capitalism, saw it as potentially leading to imperialism, maybe even fascism. Nehru's suspicion definitely shaped India's economic path favoring state control, looking more towards the Soviet model sometimes.
Which is pretty much the polar opposite of how many Americans saw capitalism as freedom itself. And I guess Nehru's socialist leanings looked like a slippery slope to communism from the U.S. perspective.
Exactly right. That ideological gap, it made genuine cooperation incredibly tough. And then, as Payne highlights, you had Nehru, his advisor Krishna Menon, and Indira Gandhi. They weren't exactly known for mincing words with American VIPs.
Uh-oh.
Apparently, some totally insulting remarks were made. Not great for diplomacy.
Ouch. Yeah, not the best way to build a friendship,
Yeah.
especially, as you said, compared to Pakistan, which was reportedly much more welcoming.
Right. So right from the get-go, you've got these ideological clashes, these personal frictions, setting a really difficult tone.
Okay, so that brings us to one of the early flashpoints, Kashmir.
Yes. And Nehru, as Payne points out, initially thought the U.S. would naturally back India.
Because India was a secular democracy. It seems logical on paper.
On paper, maybe.
Yeah.
But was it a bit naive given U.S. Cold War priorities? Probably. Because the U.S., under Eisenhower, had one overriding goal: contain the Soviet Union.
Right.
And this led to the strategy they called Pactomania, basically building a network of military alliances.
Like the Baghdad Pact.
Exactly. Aimed at creating the security belt in the Middle East, blocking Soviet expansion. And Pakistan was seen as crucial for this northern tier.
Okay.
So to get Pakistan on board, the U.S. offered a pretty significant military aid package.
Which must have set off alarm bells in New Delhi.
Big time. Nehru saw this U.S.-Pakistan military deal as a direct threat. He predicted, pretty accurately it turns out, that those weapons wouldn't be used against the Soviets, but against India.
And he wasn't quiet about it, I assume?
Not at all. He warned it would have serious consequences for U.S.-India relations. And Payne marks this as a major turning point. It created this sense of betrayal, damaged relations for decades.
Wow.
Even Eisenhower himself apparently admitted later it was a big mistake. The lesson learned, the hard way, was that in that region, backing one side militarily just looked like a threat to the other. Simple as that.
So yeah, those early interactions were definitely not building bridges. Then comes the Korean War, another instance where the U.S. expected India to just fall in line.
The expectation was certainly there. Communist regime versus a UN effort led mainly by the U.S. Surely India, the democracy, would join in.
But India had just got independence, setting its own course. This non-alignment policy.
Precisely. India did condemn North Korea's invasion, yes, but it stuck firmly to non-alignment. That was a core principle independence from the big power blocs.
So, no military involvement?
No. Nehru pushed for a peaceful resolution. India saw its role as a neutral mediator, even helping with the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission after the war. And importantly, they wanted to keep lines open with China, which had jumped into the war.
So, a much more nuanced approach than the U.S. perhaps wanted. Where did Pakistan stand in all this?
Well, according to Payne, Pakistan was actually pretty ticked off with how the U.S. treated India during Korea.
Really? Why?
From Pakistan's view, they'd clearly picked a side. They aligned with the West, signed security deals, even let U.S. spy planes fly from their bases, taking significant risks.
And it felt India was getting treated too softly, despite being non-aligned.
Something like that. A real contrast in approaches and perceptions.
Okay, let's jump forward a bit. 1961, the annexation of Goa. Another point of friction.
Oh, definitely. A big one. For India, Goa was simple. The last piece of European colonialism on their soil. It had to go.
So Operation Vijay, the military action, was seen as reclaiming rightful territory.
Absolutely. Swift, decisive, and widely supported within India.
But the U.S., under Kennedy this time, sided with Portugal. That seems odd.
It seems odd looking back, maybe. But it was Cold War realpolitik. Portugal was a NATO founder, and crucially, they hosted vital U.S. military bases in the Azores.
Ah, strategic interest trumping anti-colonial principles.
That's how India saw it. They felt deeply betrayed. A nation championing self-determination, siding with a colonial power. It felt like pure hypocrisy.
And reinforced that mistrust.
Hugely. Payne calls it a real turning point.
It sounds like it. But then, wait, just a year later, 1962, the Sino-Indian War. There was some cooperation then.
Yes, a very important, though brief, exception. When China invaded, India was in a desperate spot and appealed for help.
And the U.S. responded.
Yes, Kennedy's administration acted quickly. Military aid, diplomatic support, air lists of arms, equipment, condemning China's aggression.
So for a moment, a shared threat brought them together.
Exactly. A rare moment of alignment. But, as Payne stresses, it didn't last. Once the immediate crisis passed, India went back to its non-alignment policy, wary of getting locked into alliances.
And relations cooled off again?
Pretty much. Which leads us to the next big conflict, the 1965 India-Pakistan War.
Right. India was still recovering from the 62 war. Nehru had died in 64. Pakistan saw an opening.
That seems to be the calculation. And remember that U.S. military aid to Pakistan. Despite promises it wouldn't be used against India.
They used U.S. tanks.
They did. In a major offensive, India responded with a surprise attack towards Lahore.
And the U.S. reaction, an arms embargo on both.
Yes. But, as Payne points out, this hit Pakistan much harder. They were far more dependent on U.S. supplies than India was at that point.
So another unintended consequence.
A painful lesson, as Payne puts it. The U.S. trying to balance things, but it often backfired.
It really sounds like it. Okay, then 1967, the famine in India. The UN sends a lot of wheat aid. Surely that helped relations.
You'd think so. It was a massive amount of aid, like 20% of the U.S. wheat crop, worth $1.5 billion then. Critically needed. But the delivery wasn't smooth. President Johnson, LBJ, was apparently very frustrated with India.
Why?
India's perceived closeness to North Vietnam during the Vietnam War really rubbed him the wrong way.
So his feelings about Vietnam affected famine relief.
It seems that way.
Huh.
Payne's research suggests Johnson deliberately delayed aid shipments, made the deliveries unreliable, basically treated it like a handout, not partnership.
Wow. That must have infuriated Indira Gandhi.
It absolutely did. She apparently vowed then and there that India would achieve food self-sufficiency so they'd never be in that dependent position again.
A powerful reaction. Shows how even humanitarian aid can get tangled in politics. And all this seems to be building up to what Payne calls the pivotal 1971 war, the one that really pushed things over the edge.
Definitely a watershed moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Pakistani elections, the Awami League victory in East Pakistan, the West Pakistani military crackdown, leading to horrific violence and a massive refugee crisis, millions pouring into India.
A huge burden on India, and they asked the U.S. for help.
They did. They asked the U.S. to press China not to intervene if war broke out and to raise the human rights atrocities at the UN.
And the U.S. response was?
Basically, nothing. Worse than nothing, actually. According to Payne, the Nixon administration actually blamed India for the ensuing war.
Blamed India for reacting to a genocide and refugee crisis on its border.
That was the U.S. stance.
Yeah.
And you can imagine Indira Gandhi's reaction. Absolute fury.
So instead of pulling India towards the West, this pushed India further away.
Precisely. India felt it had no choice. It signed a friendship treaty, essentially a military pact with the Soviet Union. It upgraded relations with North Vietnam, everything the U.S. didn't want.
And the U.S. retaliated.
Yeah, by doing things like shutting down visas for American scholars wanting to study India. Payne notes this had a real long-term impact on American understanding of the region, damaging university programs.
What a mess. And there was another consequence too, right? Regarding nuclear weapons.
Yes. The feeling in India, after the U.S. inaction and perceived tilt towards Pakistan and China in '71, was that they couldn't rely on anyone else for security, especially against China. This directly fueled the drive for India's own nuclear capability.
So the '71 war fallout was huge. Payne's description of it as a total mess sounds about right.
It really does capture the depth of the breakdown.
And the story doesn't quite end there. Even later, in the 80s, U.S. actions in Afghanistan had spillover effects in Kashmir, didn't they?
Yes, that's another complex layer. The U.S. was pouring money and weapons into Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, to help the Mujahideen fight the Soviets in Afghanistan. A classic Cold War strategy.
But what happened after the Soviets left Afghanistan?
Well, the concern and evidence suggests that the ISI didn't just pack up shop. They redirected a lot of those resources fighters they'd trained, weapons, funds, towards fueling the insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir.
You mean U.S.-supplied weapons ended up being used by militant groups in Kashmir, like Hizbul Mujahideen or Lashkar-e-Taiba?
That's the deeply concerning picture. This contributed to a terrible escalation of violence, an atmosphere of fear.
Leading to the exodus of the Kashmiri Pandits.
Exactly. A tragic displacement of between 100,000 and 150,000 people. Notes how these events have been described, ethnic cleansing, even genocide by some, because of the systematic targeting. It's an incredibly painful and sensitive part of the region's history.
Still a deeply contested and complex issue today.
Very much so. The Kashmir conflict has such deep roots, involves so many players. It's not easily resolved.
So, looking back at this whole period, this deep dive based on Sarah Payne's work, it's just striking. A relationship that, on paper, looked like a natural fit, two big democracies, was just riddled with misunderstandings, different priorities, major miscalculations.
Absolutely. The U.S. backing of Pakistan, India's fierce commitment to non-alignment, flashpoints like Goa, the '71 war, they all dug these trenches of mistrust. So many missed opportunities for a stronger partnership.
And it's amazing how those early decisions, those missteps, just cast such a long shadow.
I really did. The legacy of that Cold War dynamic, you can argue, still influences how the U.S. and India interact even now.
Yeah, which really makes you think, doesn't it? Considering all those missed chances, those deep issues we've talked about, what if? How might things have been different in South Asia, maybe even globally, if the U.S. or India had approached things differently in those crucial early Cold War years? And what lessons can we actually pull from this tangled history for international relations today? Definitely something to mull over.